A blend of new ideas and old ideals. Technology news from the city and from the countryside. Plus stories from growing up on the farm. A variety of information, but always from the same rural perspective. Now here are co-hosts, Grant Nelson and Dave Nelson, with the Rural Reflections Podcast.
Welcome to the Rural Reflections Podcast. You've got Rural Reflections West in the form of Dave Nelson out in Carrington, North Dakota. Myself, Grant Nelson, here. I am Rural Reflections East at the studios of Thief River Falls Radio, and we are talking with Dave right now, who's inside a nice air-conditioned pickup underneath a tree. Dave, it doesn't get much better than that when you're on a hot day like today.
Yeah, it's a good place to be right now. The heat was pretty oppressive yesterday, although it wasn't a lot of humidity, so a guy could take it a little better. But it's a nice place to be right now, but I can't stay here all day.
No. You know, there was a deluge yesterday of photos, and when I say yesterday, I'm talking Friday. There was a deluge of photos of people taking pictures of their thermometers, either inside the house, they've got remote thermometers, or else they had them in the car, and there was some really shocking temps out there. I saw in excess of 100 several times at our place, probably in the 90s. What was it like out in Carrington at the end of the week, Dave?
104 was the high yesterday.
Ooh.
And it was windy, but it said it felt like 106, so we must have had a teeny bit of humidity, but it wasn't much fun.
You know, this has been the most odd end of May that I can recall, at least certainly in the last 10, 15 years. We've had the danger of excessive heat. We've had the danger of excessive lack of heat in the form of frost. It's been windier than heck. It's been too dry. This week we were talking with Angie Peltier from the University of Minnesota Extension in Crookston, and she said that an even greater problem than the dry temps was the wind. It had scoured the dirt down to a point where it had exposed the seed. What's it been like out there, Dave? I know you've been dry. Have you had the big wind too, or?
Yeah, we've had some pretty strong winds. It hasn't been. There was a dust stormish day or two in there, but nothing too terrible. You know, I mean, there's a lot of no-till farming out here, so that helps a lot. But our crops are all damaged, I would say, pretty much. Some of them just seeded again, guys out reseeding in that, so it's not good at all, I guess.
No, I'm sorry. It's hard to hear that sort of thing. And I like the idea that they've got the no-till going on there. Again, when we spoke with Angie Peltier earlier this week, she talked about the structure of soils and how important that is to have some structure within the soil to hold it. And, of course, we talked a little bit about having some trees to slow down that wind is a really nice thing. And particularly in places where you have a lot of open area, it's great to have that no-till, to have some structure in the soil, to have organic matter to hold everything together so we don't get those big dust storms. Now, this morning before I came into the radio station, I was out doing a little mapping. We've got something called the Black River Impoundment that is, I think it's 640 acres. I think that's how big it is. I think it's a whole section. And I've been doing a little drone mapping, taking many pictures. This morning, I think I took 287 pictures with my drone, and that was just over the course of really a few minutes. And those will be stitched together into one large map that you can drag and pull around, and you can turn to a 3D perspective. And what I've been doing some mapping of the impoundment itself, inlets, outlets, some of the work that they've been doing as far as the ditches that feed it, and then also as the local electric cooperative moves poles back and redoes some of the underground utilities, such as the high-speed internet. Now, I've got my mapping done for the day, but I know you've been doing some mapping out there in Carrington too, Dave, at High Plains Equipment.
Yeah, we were mapping at about 7:30 this morning because there wasn't any wind of our new building site. It's about 20 acres. But funny you said you're mapping and counted your pictures. We had 404 on ours, and I'm guessing it's probably ready now. I haven't looked on Drone Deploy for it, but it's probably ready to view now. But just kind of odd that we were both doing it at the same time.
Yeah, and it's odd that you can tell we grew up being frugal people because we're both counting the pictures. And of course, the one thing I do too, and I'm sure you do the same thing, if there's a picture that comes through there that doesn't really, it doesn't belong or it doesn't make any sense to be in there, I'll write them down. And then when I get ready to upload them into the cloud, I'll go ahead and delete them before I put them up. I mean, if they're not part of the importance of the map or anything like that, I'll pull those out. Now, you've been working with drones, particularly in agriculture, for a lot longer than I have. Most of my work using drones has been with either real estate or with construction. Now, something that we're all going to experience, though, in the next year and a half, actually in the next 2.5 years, but certainly the FAA wants to have this up by their deadline, which is about 1 year and 4 months, I believe, right now, is remote ID. Now, remote ID is not something that we all, I think, understand, maybe at least if you're not in the industry of using drones for commercial purposes. So recently, I spoke with Nick Flom, Executive Director at Vantis. Vantis is one of those businesses out of North Dakota that is putting together the remote ID system, which will be deployed all across the United States. And there's several stages to the remote ID. And the first stage they're going on right now is just basically being able to ID or identify a drone and the operator that's flying it. So I wanted to hear from Nick just a little bit, and I wondered if you could listen to it too, Dave, and we'll just find out a little bit about what remote ID is.
On the front end, it's probably more in alignment with just visual line of sight. It's more in alignment with just giving law enforcement agencies a tool of broadcasting where the pilot is operating, where the UAS is, and ultimately who it is.
When we talk about with law enforcement, are we talking about somebody flies into a stadium knowing who they are, or are we talking about actually being at a scene where somebody needs a drone to help law enforcement and they want to make sure that they can know where it's at all times, or how does law enforcement play into this?
I would actually say more of, not as much of the latter, more of the identification of, someone in an environment where, let's start with just almost like a friend or foe kind of component, where you have, an operator who's up flying. They need to broadcast their information down. Law enforcement agencies are going to have essentially, I'm going to overly simplify, but an app that is going to be able to really tell, who it is, where they are. And, if this person is not broadcasting their position and they're not giving that information, almost out of the gate, you're going, this is somebody who I need to probably pay a little bit closer attention to, or this is a drone that I need to pay, is not following, the set of rules that they should be. If I give a little bit of an analogy, of it's almost like a license plate, for your car. And as myself, when I'm driving down the street, if I see a license plate, I get to go, hey, this guy's from Minnesota, this guy's from North Dakota. And that's really about the extent that I get to know about that person. Where a law enforcement, they can put in the license plate number. They're going to be able to go, oh, that's John, and he has, no warrants out for his arrest, or whatever they happen to be looking up. And then you have the person who has no license plate on. And, that's probably going to pique the attention of, well, it does for me even as a as a civilian driver, but also for law enforcement. Like, hey, who is this guy? Because they're not even telling us who they are. Is this car properly registered or not? Almost go down that same type of alignment with remote ID.
You know, Dave, I think what this is all about is about building trust and accountability, which is a big part of moving forward with any business. That's what it sounds like to me. How about you?
Yeah, probably. They've been threatening to do something, wanting people to get licensed and so on. So I can understand, wanting to know who's doing what with them, because there are people that are using them for things other than honorable reasons.
That's right. Dave, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with more on the Rural Reflections podcast. Welcome back to the Rural Reflections podcast. You've got Dave Nelson out west. You've got Grant Nelson here out east. And now we've got a lot of things going on here, Dave. Graduation, which, of course, everybody has, but things are a little bit more normal. Thief River Falls just had their graduation this weekend, much more normal than last year. And now we're preparing for the county fairs and getting ready for what we hope is going to be a much more normal county fair, although they are going to be doing some remote judging and some earlier judging that they found that they kind of enjoyed after they tried it last year. But out in North Dakota, out around the Carrington area, you've got quite a bit of stuff going on out there right now this weekend.
Well, yeah, we've been we're on a major highway, so we see a lot of what's going on, and there's been an awful lot of vintage classic cars coming through. It's called Devil's Run, and what it is it's a car parade, a lengthy car parade, and that of vintage vehicles through Devil's Lake and the surrounding area, and then a bunch of other things going on in town that have to do with it. And here in Carrington, we have what's called Legendary 4. It's the Van Bedoff Dairy open house, and they give up 4 hours every 2 years to invite the public out to see their procedures and product that they have. And they have I don't know, I'm sure there's other dairies that are as nice as this, but I've never been in one. And they show off their facilities and their animals and try and introduce the local people to what actually goes on at a dairy farm.
And now this is Legendary, spelled Dairy. So the Van Bedoffs know how to promote a little bit too, which I think is awesome, because that's part of what farmers have to do nowadays, is get out there and tell people how things operate and show how great their farms are. And when you talk about the Van Bedoffs, I've been out there with you before, and it's almost shocking how none of the cows moo while you're there. They're all just so content. They're amazingly happy, and they're totally at ease. And I love that they have people come out and they what, ice cream, that sort of thing, Dave?
Oh, they'll have gelato because
yes.
Their daughter runs the Cows and Company Creamery. She's making cheese now too, but cheese and gelato, and I'm sure they'll be serving that. The cheese thing is just getting started, so you may not be able to get a sample of that right now, but they're great promoters of agriculture, and they do the absolute best job that is possible for them to do with everything they do.
Okay. Now, there's a lot of hard work that goes behind all farming. Right now, I think my connection to farming is always going to be more deep through the livestock portion. And in the last week or two, I've seen an awful lot of semis moving hay around. And we're just starting to cut alfalfa around here. Even though there's not a ton of it out there, I saw people are starting to cut their alfalfa. So it's really not time to move new alfalfa around so much. So that causes me to believe that it's probably some of the carryover alfalfa and grass hay that's being moved to farms that don't have a lot of pasture. Now, in our area up here, Dave, Stephen, Argyle, Florian, some of the towns just south of the Canadian border have had plenty of rain. But around this area, around Thief River Falls, south of here, we've been out without much rain. Well, we had 1/10 of an inch last night, so we're right now at about 6 or 7/10 for the whole spring. And that's been a real downer for pasture land. Now, I was checking the NDSU Grassland Center, and this was actually on a trip not so far from you, but they talked about that right now there's going to be about 35% of normal forage for pasture, and with that, there's probably not going to be any alfalfa cutting or pasture cutting or grass cutting in your area. So the balance here is, do you spend money on hay or do you sell the cattle? And I think there's a lot of people who are probably going to have to consider this. Maybe not so much in our area. I think most of the farms in our area probably are going to be in that portion of Minnesota where there has been some rain and there is some pasture, but there's some who aren't. And out in North Dakota, of course, much larger ranches with a lot more cattle, and this can be a lot more painful when it happens. Have you seen any rain around Carrington, up northwest of you, to the west of you, or are you still really struggling?
We're really struggling for rain. We had 200 last night here. About 15 miles southeast of here, I've heard as much as 80. But as far as west and northwest and southwest, not much for rain. And things are really drying up. I mean, people are debating what to do with pasture, if they should turn the cattle on there and just wreck what little they have, or if they're, going to have to save it for a while. It hasn't been much optimism for haying in that. I hear a lot of people say they're going to have to sell, 50 head or 100 head or 30 head or whatever. So it's going to take a toll on some of the cattle farmers and so on. But
for those who are out there making hay though right now, most of them big round bales or else big square bales. You and I came from an era of the small square bale. And this was done because, of course, that's the technology we had. But, of course, it was nice to be able to handle those smaller bales. And you needed smaller bales because there were a lot of dairy farms in our neck of the woods and probably in the United States back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Kind of started to neck down in the 80s. And, of course, by the 90s and early 2000s, there weren't a whole bunch of them. Larger dairy farms, obviously, but not as many of the smaller ones. And they were doing things on more of a scale where they used the larger bale. But you and I both came from an era where you handled a lot of small square bales and you spent a lot of time out there making one at a time, in our case with the International 300. And I think, let's see here, we started out, I think there was an International when I started baling, and we moved to New Holland after that. But there's a certain kind of enjoyment in doing small square bales as long as everything worked, Dave.
Well, yeah, if you were the guy driving the tractor, wasn't too bad. Loading them on the hay rack and then unloading them and then loading them up to put them into the barn and then stacking them in the barn and then throwing them down to the cows and dragging them around in front of the cows. It was pretty labor intensive, Didn't really do any of us any harm doing it, but wasn't the most fun. Square bales still have a little place in the world. Horse people seem to always be in demand of them. We service NDSU with equipment, and there's one square baler that goes to NDSU this year. And I believe it's got something to do with their equine program that's in Fargo. I'm not just quite sure how it works, but so they're still out there. People still using square bales, but if I was feeding a bunch of cattle right now, I'd try my darndest to find a way to feed them round bales or silage or chopped hay or something like that. That's
for sure. Those big round bales, they were such a labor saver. I mean, they saved on labor in two ways. They saved on the actual physical labor you had to do, and then just the amount of time which you had to devote performing labor to keep the cattle fed. It just made it a lot better. Now, I remember thinking to myself when I would bale small squares, I enjoyed it. I liked it as long as it wasn't too hot. I would have loved if we had had a little umbrella on top of the tractor. That would have been wonderful. And I always knew I had a water jug at the end, like probably in the fence line or somewhere in there. So I always had that. So I was good with that. But the thing that drove me crazy was the nodder. If the nodder started not working right, yeah, I mean, there was probably some adjustment you could make, but there was at some point where you basically just had to kind of switch everything out, because it seemed like once the nodder started acting naughty, there was really no coming back from that, Dave.
Yeah, I know that was a real frustration with the square balers if there was a problem, and knowing what to do at that point was kind of an art for people, because you had to be pretty seasoned on a baler to make the right adjustment when you had a problem.
Yeah, and then if things went totally bad and something broke, then you had to time it, which was a series of finding little marks at different places and at different junctures and making sure all of those came together, which was certainly no harder than creating like maybe a great symphony or something like that, right?
Right. Yeah, it took a bit to put things back together when you had a major thing. The worst thing was if you ever sheared the needles off, then that became a big job all of a sudden.
Yes, it did. Dave, I suppose I better let you go. You got anything else for us before we say goodbye?
No, it's going to be the same as always. I guess we're just going to keep hoping and praying for rain.
Sounds good. We'll do the same. Dave, we'll have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you next week, okay? There he is, my brother Dave Nelson. He's Rural Reflections West out in Carrington, North Dakota. I'm Grant Nelson here at the studios of Thief River Falls Radio, and this is the Rural Reflections Podcast.